Welcome back to DemystifySci. I'm Shiloh.
I'm Anastasia.
This is the place where we search for the theories that will change the world. And today we are looking at the mechanism underpinning something quite terrifying, which has been unfolding over the past few years, but perhaps has been going on much longer than that, which is the apparent suicide of Western civilization. And there are many people, perhaps you are one of them, or you've encountered somebody who throws their hands up and says, I don't understand why in the world these institutions are committing suicide and destroying themselves the way they are. Our guest today, Dr. Dani Sulikowski, has an answer for that question. And she points to an adaptive mechanism for why this is all happening, which concerns intrasexual female mate suppression.
There's been a lot of conversation about the fact that the declining birth rates in Europe and America and Australia, even all the way through, Italy, South Korea, Russia, like nobody really knows why it is that they're happening. And Dr. Sulikowski proposes this intrasexual mate suppression as being the reason for it, where it's this competitive edge that emerges in women themselves that induce them to convince other women not to have children. And we start the conversation by getting Dr. Sulikowski's perspective on how she thinks all of this works. And we kind of arrive at this weird conclusion, which is that, well, perhaps it's female emancipation that's caused all of these problems. And the fact that women are in the workforce and they're liberated and they don't need men. And so what's happening is that they basically are transmitting this mimetic idea to other women that the source of happiness and the source of satisfaction is not family and children and a domestic existence, but in reality, it's all of this other stuff. And what's really fascinating over the course of this conversation, which I find to be the best part of any conversation, is that we really start to untangle the question of whether or not some phenomenon, in this case, intrasexual mate suppression by women, is that the true cause of a declining birth rate and the disruption of all of our institutions? Or is there something else that started much before the modern era that is actually this piece that's been running in the background that is now becoming the dumpster fire that appears to be the modern age?
This is really, really complex, and I don't want to give away all the punchlines up front, but we get into some really cool novel territory, and it really has expanded my view of the toolkit possible for explaining all of the dumpster fire. So maybe you have a missing piece of this puzzle too. You might want to sign up for Paradigm Drift. That's our new segment where you, the audience, can show up and put your name in a hat for a chance to present your idea with the world. We'll give you 60 seconds to do it. And if you can make a compelling case, maybe we'll invite you back without having to sign up. And if you really knock it out of the park, maybe you'll end up on the podcast explaining it to us at length one day.
And a reminder, before we let you get to the conversation, that this is a program that is purely supported by its viewers. For us, it's really, really important to make sure that this is a place that is not rife with advertisements, that we are not selling you things that you don't need, or interrupting deep discussions for pitches for weird AI sleep machines or dubious supplements. We really believe that we are producing something that's useful for the world, and that the people for whom it is useful will be the people that support us. And so with that said, you should come over to patreon.com/demystifysci because we have a tier where you can donate just 75 cents a week. And if everybody who listened to this podcast donated 75 cents a week, we would be able to have a studio where we could invite people to record in person as opposed to recording remotely. We would be able to host regular in-person events like Paradigm Drift, like we've been talking about hosting a camping trip at some, like renting a Boy Scout lodge and having tent cabins and having people be able to just come out for a long weekend in the summer with their families so that we can really spend time together as a community.
We could have scholarships for our conference series where we could bring in more young folks who can't necessarily afford to put themselves up in a hotel for the whole week. And we could
have the conferences regularly at least once a year. We could have a quarterly live event where we actually made this into more of a community where people can come together and meet. as opposed to something that's just on the internet, remote, asynchronous. We already have something like that at Patreon, which is that we meet every Sunday with our patrons. We have our Sunday salons. And that's been really instrumental for us in growing this podcast, because it means that we're constantly talking to the people who are listening to it and getting their insights onto the topics that drive them. And so if you have 75 cents a week and you really want to see us grow and you want to see this become something that isn't just a podcast recorded through Zoom, then we would love to see you there. And it would really help us transform the world into more of what we want to see.
With that, enjoy the conversation with Dani Sulikowski about the evolutionary payout of bringing society to its knees.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The DemystifySci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
It's really funny because you go to the Wikipedia page and you look for mate suppression, it takes you to reproductive suppression, and there's nothing about humans on that page.
No.
And it's mostly, I think it's about like lemurs and naked mole rats and
Meerkats.
Rats is a big one. Yeah, rats is a big one. So rodents do it. Rodents do it a lot. And I think I'm not an expert on this in rodents, but from what I can tell, the consensus is moving towards, in rodents, it not being manipulative. So for a long time, it was assumed that what was effectively happening is that, we'll just say rats, the dominant female rat, because rats sort of have a bit of a matriarchal social structure, right? So that the dominant ones are the females, and all the dominant one is a female. So the dominant female will breed, and the other females around her will not. And for a while, it was just presumed that must be manipulative, in that the dominant female was doing something physiologically, presumably, that was preventing the other ones breeding, and it was in the interests of the reproductive interests of the dominant female, and it wasn't in the reproductive interests of the other. However, now it would seem, I think, that the consensus is moving towards, actually, it's in the reproductive interests of all rats to have just one reproducing at a time in that type of a system. And so it's not actually manipulative reproductive suppression, it's more like cooperative reproductive suppression. So the rats being suppressed are sort of voluntarily, I'm not talking about agency here, I'm talking about their own bodies physiologically, voluntarily suppressing their own reproduction, because that's actually what's ultimately best for their inclusive fitness at the end of the day. So, and there's still debate about that. I just imagining somebody out there who's studied this for the whole life going, no, that's not what we think. But I think that is the direction that the people are moving towards, that it's not manipulative. And it's ultimately working in the interests of everybody. Whereas in humans, what I'm positing is that it is manipulative. So it is definitely antagonistic, in that the individuals who are being reproductively suppressed are indeed bearing a net reproductive cost as a result of that happening. I'm not sort of necessarily suggesting a cooperative system like what we're seeing in the rat. So I'm suggesting something that's a bit different to that.
I think it's probably time for us to unveil what it is you're suggesting exactly.
Yeah.
Let's get into the meat of it. So what's happening in the world
today? So how do we kind of make this digestible? So let's start small. So the first sort of extension to the current understanding of intersexual competition, it's restricted to the time of mate choice. So the first thing that I would say is, well, that's an unnecessary and nonsensical restriction. There is going to be selection pressure on, in favor of any mechanism that will boost your own reproductive success or decrease the reproductive success of rivals at any point across the life cycle. There's no reason for intersexually competitive mechanisms to be limited to the point at which mate choice happens. Because recall that reproductive success, in terms of its currency, its evolutionary currency, is relative reproductive success. It's not absolute reproductive success. So an individual can improve their own net reproductive success even by keeping their own reproductive output the same, but by damaging the reproductive output of those around them, right? That's still a relative net gain. So what you see, especially much more in women than what you see in men, is you see women engaging in a lot of reproductive sabotage of other women. The reason why this would be selected for more strongly in women than in men is exactly the same reason why societies send men away to fight wars, right? We send men away to fight wars because we can lose a lot of men out of a couple of generations, and the population can very quickly recover for obvious reasons. If you lost the same proportion of women instead of men, it would take much longer for the population to recover, right? So that's because women, the number of reproductively active viable women in the population sets your reproductive cap, right? That's what sets the cap. So if individual women can effectively knock other women out of the reproductive gene pool, or at least damage and inhibit their reproductive success, the result of that is going to be a net drop in the population's overall reproductive success. A net drop in the background reproductive success is a relative gain for every woman not affected by that drop. And the person doing that behavior is not affected by that drop because she's doing it to everyone else. Okay, so that's why these behaviors get selected for in women. In men, the same types of behaviors just don't have a rate of return, right? So a man knocking a whole heap of other men out of the reproductive gene pool is not going to see a net drop in the population's reproductive rate. He's not going to get a benefit. That's what kind of starts this off as a female-specific behavior, this whole sabotage. So the first thing that I'm sort of proposing is that female-female sabotage is a type of intersexual competition that we see across the lifespan. And we're starting to collect pretty good evidence in my lab now that this is the case. So just as sort of some examples of how women will inhibit each other's reproductive success outside of the context of mate choice, we see things like we sort of call it competitive mothering, although that word can mean other things as well, but we can call it competitive mothering, where women will attempt to interfere with each other's parenting strategies. So by giving other women really what you believe is actually really bad parenting advice, so encouraging other women to parent ineffectively and in fact to parent inefficiently. Giving other women giving other women advice to prioritize things other than investment in their children. So this is quite a big one. So this can be
this
things
really happens. Like I feel so like my naivete is being shattered on the floor right now. I feel like.
So to add an example to this, I think that one of the most well-known toxic places on the internet is mommy forums.
Oh yeah.
Where women gather to talk about motherhood, and basically I have a bunch of people in my life that have just had children, and so they end up in these spaces and are immediately horrified because everybody's super neurotic, everybody polices everybody's behavior really tightly. It's this.
But with bad advice, that's the part that I'm just like, holy cow! Like that's a common feature.
Yeah. So I've got a really nice concrete example actually, and this one I'm especially confident in because we collected data on this last year, and so I know this actually happens. So this is something we observed in those mothers' forums, and then we went about collecting some data to demonstrate that this actually does occur. So one thing that happens when you have a baby, right, the mother is doing the breastfeeding because she's the one with the boobs, right? This is a pretty hard and fast division of labor, not something that's really up for debate, right? And so one of the consequences of that is that the mother, if you are going to breastfeed, if we're not going to sort of bring bottles and things into it, whatever, because we're just talking about breastfeeding, then if the mum is going to feed the baby at night, obviously she's going to be up at night every 2 or 3 hours, and she's going to be feeding the baby. What is the most sensible thing to do then is a very efficient division of labour is for the husband to make sure that he's getting sleep. Because a very dangerous thing to have when you have a young baby around that you need to look after is having two chronically tired people who are prone to making terrible mistakes. So you need to have, whenever possible, you need to have someone sleeping because there's not going to be a lot of sleep happening in total. So somebody has to be sleeping, which means if mum's getting up to do the nighttime feeds, dad has to be asleep so that when he's awake later, mum can get some sleep. A very terrible thing to do is to insist that dad should get up in the middle of the night to help mum with the nighttime feeds, even though she doesn't need any help, just to help her and support her. Very inefficient division of labour, very damaging in those early few weeks. And what we noticed on these mummy forums was women effectively shaming each other and shaming each other's husbands for not getting up in the middle of the night just because how dare he sleep when you can't, which of course is the exact opposite of what you should do. So we set up a study with a little vignette that described scenarios around breastfeeding and described how it was not working for a particular woman to have her husband, he wanted to be helpful, but it wasn't working because she didn't need him and he wasn't getting sleep, and she's now just doing the nighttime feeds on her own, and this is now working much better. And women who self-reported being more intrasexually competitive were also much more likely to indicate that they would advise that woman that she was doing the wrong thing and she needed to make sure that her husband got up with her and helped her do those nighttime feeds.
But
So,
do you have evidence that they're deceiving in these messages? Like, are they doing one thing and advocating another? Because that would be the crux of the biscuit.
yes, we did also ask them what they would do themselves. And so when we asked them what they would do themselves, they were much more likely to say that if they were in that situation, they would let their husband sleep. And we didn't ask the same, and we didn't ask the same people either. So it's not like people knew that we were asking about them and asking about someone else. So what we did is we actually had like a mixed design. So we had different versions of the vignette. So the one about you and the one about someone else was two completely different vignettes. So people gave completely different answers, but then of course we did the cross comparisons with people in different groups. So yes, we also asked them what they would do themselves, and irrespective of how intersexually competitive they reported themselves being, women generally just said that they themselves would let their husband sleep and they would do the feeding, whereas they told somebody else, oh no, you should make sure your husband wakes up. He should, if you have to be up, he should have to be up too. And then that difference was bigger for women who were higher on intersexual competition.
You also had an interesting study, which I had actually come across before ever hearing about you, about the way that women suggest haircut strategies for other women.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that was a great one too. That study was actually motivated by my then stepdaughter, who went to the hairdresser and got not what she asked for. And she was quite upset, and that actually was the beginning of the germ of the idea for that study. In any case, what we did in that study is we also set up a series of vignettes, and we told participants that they were hairdressers, or to imagine that they were hairdressers, and that the women that the vignettes were about were their clients, and they had to advise their clients how much hair they should get cut off. And so we had a variety of different conditions, partly just so that the vignettes would be different, but also because we wanted to be able to create the specific circumstances in which cutting off hair would definitely be sabotage. So in the condition where the women were reported as having very healthy hair, and for each vignette we also included like a little close-up picture of the hair so we could show like beautiful healthy hair or terribly damaged split ends hair. And in the condition where the hair was depicted as being very healthy and described as being very healthy, and the client was described as wanting the minimum cut off possible, women who were higher on intersexual competition advised those clients to cut off more hair. And over a couple of studies where we varied the attractiveness of the clients, what we saw is that women targeted that advice most strongly. So advised that the most hair be cut off the women that they perceived to be about as attractive as themselves. So the women that they perceived to be their mate value rivals. So people mate assortatively, right? So the highest mate value people mate with each other, and so on down the ladder. So a woman of approximately equal attractiveness to you, when all you know about someone is their physical appearance, is also a woman of approximately equal mate value. And that's, of course, is your strongest mating rival, and that's who the women were cutting the most hair off. So
I'm surprised about the self-reporting of intersexual
I was gonna ask
intersexual
about that too.
competition.
Like, how do you score that? How do you know how intersexually competitive someone is?
Yeah, because my instinct would be to be like, I'm not competitive at all.
That's actually a very interesting question, and a very big question. So there's a scale that is that has been, I think it's like I should know the year because I'd use this scale and cite it all the time. You'd think I'd know the year it was published. Is it terrible that I don't? I'm an embarrassment to myself. Anyway, there is a scale that people use for this. It's a very short scale. It's 12 items, and it asks things. What it actually asks about is just a general subjective competitiveness that people have towards members of the same sex. So the items are things like, I would not want to hire a very attractive woman at work. I would not want, that's like a female version. And like and an item might also be, I don't like it when another man has a nicer car than mine, or, I don't like it when another woman has a nicer house than mine. So it's just it's trying to sort of tap into the kinds of intersexual competition, associated emotional responses that people have, so envy and jealousy and things like that of the same sex, and using things like attractiveness, because that's obviously important for mate value, competence is important for mate value, and then things like having a nice house and a nice car are also status symbols and are important for mate value. So people that are high in intersexual competition should theoretically experience more jealousy and envy around those things as well. So that's how the scale is constructed, and it's proven to have incredible utility. It's shown a lot of theoretically sensible correlations between all manner of things and intersexual competition. So it's certainly pretty good from that regard. But I think that what I'm discovering is that it's limited to the kinds of intersexual competition that is at least a little bit overtly nasty. So when you start getting into the kinds of intersexual competition that manifests as support, the scale doesn't correlate with things as well. So the previous example I talked about women giving other women advice, we actually did see the correlations that we were looking for there, but they weren't especially strong. And I think that there's a split that in the sort of female intersexual competition strategies where there's one half that are pretty nasty and pretty overtly nasty. And you see a lot of those around mate choice with gossiping and backstabbing and destroying, rivals' reputations and whatnot. And you see a lot of it in the early motherhood stage as well. You see a fair bit of nastiness, like you say on the mums forums, the policing of behaviour and whatnot. But there's a whole other side of female competitiveness that masquerades as sisterhood. And that's not captured well by this type of a scale, and we don't actually have an alternative. So I think we actually, as I'm sort of getting into trying to measure and calculate these sort of nicer competitive behaviours that are reproductively suppressing but they're masquerading as some type of support or advice or camaraderie-ship. Whilst I can observe the behaviours and observe things that they're correlating with, they're getting less and less likely, the nicer they are, they're getting less and less likely to be associated with those negative emotional responses to the same sex, which makes mechanistic sense, but it then creates a methodological problem where we need some measure of people's, just like that is a sort of a broadly accepted measure of intersexual competition from a nasty perspective, that shouldn't necessarily correlate with things like how much hair should you cut off, unless such advice is somewhat maliciously intended. But when you start measuring forms of reproductive suppressive behaviour that are really manifesting as types of social support and are actually hijacking pro-social motives rather than sort of anti-social motives, then that creates a methodological problem. But that nevertheless is how we measure it.
And so what are other examples of this pro-social hijacking?
Yeah, what's the sisterhood thing?
So I shouldn't really laugh, but you two have just sort of like collectively just done what every man and woman do when I explain this stuff, is that the guy is like, oh my God, do women actually do this? This is so naive. And the woman's like, yeah, of course. And here's an example. And it's just like, that's exactly what you two did. It's just,
well, it's crazy because
it just makes me laugh.
Well, I know that men do all this stuff, but they're pretty on the nose about it. Like it's not hidden. Actually, we have this really funny conversation going in the background because I have a totally different experience in the world when I go out and do things by myself without Nastia there. like I have a wholly different spiritual experience in the universe. Like I see like the absolute worst in people often, that people are really,
They're
really
really mean to Shiloh.
people. I mean,
People like
not all people.
unbelievable.
Like I meet amazing, wonderful people too. I'm just saying, but I don't see the worst in men come out when I'm with my wife, right? For
Of
whatever
course.
reason, people put on a different face when you're out with a woman, and I assume even more so when you're out with a woman and a child. Like it's just a
Yeah.
totally different experience you have. But yeah, I feel like the society of men is just gloves off. Like nobody's trying to pull any punches or hide the fact that they're trying to cut you down. Like that's absolutely announced and just accepted, and I've known about that since I was 2 years old, or whenever I first started trying to socialize with other kids. So but the fact that it's going on behind the scenes with women is kind of
It's also interesting
shocking.
too, because like I go out into the world and I generally have a pretty positive experience. Like everybody's very kind to me. Like for example, I was like riding my bike around yesterday, and it's not a very bike friendly place, but everybody was very cautious, and they avoided me, and like the big trucks gave me a wide berth. And then Shiloh goes running, and he's like, yeah, people try to run me off the road. It's weird. But I have the experience where everybody's like waving to me, and they're like, oh, cool, you're running. That's so good. And so I think that it is a wildly different experience. And in terms
I
of,
see women be mean to you sometimes though, and you just don't. You act like it didn't even happen. Like you just won't see it. Almost, it's kind of an interesting strategy where you're just like, anyways,
I'm
which
just,
is awesome actually.
I like, so this is actually crazy because I've like very, very carefully curated my social circles to not have this kind of thing happen in them. But part of the time I work for a guiding company that is that has a ton of women that work at it.
Yeah.
And there was one specific trip where there was a woman who I'd never met before who was on this trip, who was like, her boyfriend was also on the trip. And she was so just subtly aggressive to me in the most middle school way possible. Like, there was a moment where we were like in the vans, and I sat down next to her, and she moved to a different seat in the van. And then I would like say something, and there was another female guide, and I would say things, and then she would like very obviously look at me, and then she would start whispering to the other guide, and then they would like both be looking at me. And I was like, what is happening right now? I didn't think that adults behaved that way. And so to me, it was just this brief glance into into a world that I have effectively avoided. And so it's very interesting to hear you talk about
Yes.
the fact that this is such a widespread phenomenon, because I think that it is possible to avoid if you curate your circles. But I think that for a lot of people, when you go, say, to the internet, there's very
Yeah.
little curation that you can do when you show up on like a mommy forum, and
That's right.
it's just this free for all. So you're exposed to this just like electric psyche that just warps you by just being in its vicinity.
And I think it's really interesting too, to the way you say that you've kind of like curated your social circles as much as possible to keep these people out, because a lot of people aren't able to do that. So as a function of where they work, as a function of who they're friends with, and sometimes even who family members might be friends with, it can be really difficult to actually avoid this type of behavior for a lot of women. I think that's I think most women would avoid it if they could. I think it's a little bit like intersexual competition and that general competitive drive is a little bit like the dark traits, psychopathy and Machiavellianism. It's the trait itself, I think, at sort of damagingly high levels is relatively rare. But just like when you get someone like that in the social circle, when you get highly competitive people in the social circle, it kind of tends to infect the whole network a little bit, and people have to sort of deal with it, and people have to push back against it. I mean, you were able you sort of said you went on that one guide with that particular woman, but imagine if that was your, 9-to-5 job 5 days a week, and you just had to be in an office with her, and she was just constantly, behaving in an incredibly childish manner, giggling behind your back. I mean, at some point you're going to have to do something. At some point you're not going to be able to just let that go, right? At some point, something's going to have to give. And so that's then you get drawn into, working out, okay, who are my friends? Who are my allies? Who am I going to get? Who's going to actually, when she does that, is going to walk away from her and come and stand next to me instead? And, then those types of social games have to begin. And so it's great if you can curate a social circle that doesn't have that. But I think for a lot of people, they just have no choice but to actually get drawn into it. And that's what makes the behaviours perhaps much more widespread than the people who kind of instigate them, who I think are relatively, I think there are relatively rare, the people who really do that super nasty stuff, especially as adults. That there's some sense in which I think that the teenage adolescent period is like the immature period of intersexual competition, where women are behaving like that, but as they get older, they learn how to get those same effects surreptitiously. They learn how to get them with subterfuge without looking nasty. The ones who still behave like that as the adults are the ones who never actually really learnt those skills. That's just a woman with really bad social skills. Still behaving like a teenager. Most women, if they want to achieve a kind of, a curation of their social circle and remove certain people from it, they don't do it like that. So that's someone I think who never grew out of that adolescent phase, because that is classic female intersexual competition, behavior amongst adolescents, that kind of deliberate attempts to ostracize and things like that. That's just what you see all the time, but less so in grown women. In grown women, like you say, it's much more subtle. It's much more like subterfuge. So a lot of it is around. It's
hard for people to learn that they even need to curate. Like, that's a hard lesson to learn, and it can be really painful.
Yeah.
Right, because there's a lot of kind
too.
of bankrupt institutional wisdom where everybody's we accept everybody into this circle and blah blah blah, which is like founded in the best intentions, but at the end of the day, like you got to be pretty good at pruning like your tree at the same time, right? And that's often a hard won piece of wisdom for young people. I know it was super painful for me, and
that is true. It's a lesson learned. It's definitely often a lesson learned.
What percentage of women don't engage in this kind of behavior? Like, when you do these studies, do you find people that just are fully resistant to it?
So this is also a really interesting question, and something is changing in the data over the last few years, or the last, I don't know, maybe 10 years. So it used to be the case that intersexuals, in older studies using this same scale, it's been used for a while now, in older studies using this scale, you tend to get similar levels of intersexual competitiveness in men and women, and it tended to be kind of normally distributed. What you're finding now is that that's still what I'm seeing for men, a rather normal distribution. So the majority of men kind of having medium levels of intersexual competitiveness, and fewer being very low and being very high. But in women, I'm starting to see, and it's come out again in the data I've collected this year, a really skewed distribution. There are many, many more women on very, very low scores on this scale than there used to be, and fewer women with very high scores, although there are some very high scores. So we're seeing a really skewed distribution, and I'm seeing a really skewed distribution, and I'm noticing it more so as time goes on. And so, like, the first thing I need to do is like a formal meta-analysis and make sure that what I'm observing is actually real. This is actually a genuine change over time. But I am kind of pretty much convinced that it is, as convinced as I can be without doing the formal meta-analysis anyway.
So really quickly, a high score means that they're more competitive?
Yes.
Okay, so you're seeing more women that have lower scores, which means that they're shifting towards being less competitive?
Well, what I'm seeing is a lot of women reporting really zero levels. Now, the thing with the items on these scale, it's a little bit like, so in one of the things that people do in social psychology is they introduce what are sort of called social desirability measures, and they contain items that it's very socially desirable to say, oh, look, I never do this. But it would also be a dishonest response to say that you never do that. So it's kind of like, oh, I never get, I've come to think what the items are, but things like, I never get angry with someone who's lied to me. I never tell white lies. I never, so a whole bunch of things that are very unlikely to actually be true, but people with a high tendency to respond in a socially desirable way will say, oh, yes, strongly agree. Yes, I never lie. I never get angry. I never blah, blah, blah. And that's how we kind of measure people who might be responding in a socially desirable way on other measures in the survey, so we can then control for that to see whether other effects that we're observing are a result of socially desirable responding, or more likely to be more reliable than that. And
I imagine that the spread of like therapy speak and just exposure to what is socially desirable and what makes a person a good person versus a bad person must be skewing this tremendously.
I suspect so. I'm not quite sure how widespread that is. That's widespread in particular demographics, which may be also the same demographics where data comes from, especially data that's collected in online surveys and things like that. But I'm not quite sure how widespread generally as a phenomena that is. But what I was going to say, though, is that a lot of the items on the intersexual competitiveness scale are a little bit like the social desirability items that lead me to question somebody who has such a low score that they've indicated that none of these items are applicable to them at all ever. And so what I think this is going to turn out to be, or one of the things I'm wondering if it might turn out to be, is probably a better way to put it, is that we're almost seeing a shift to the more fake nice forms of intersexual competition. So the more camaraderie, this is sisterhood type intersexual competition, and less aggro intersexual competition. And so we're seeing these people who are kind of overdoing the niceness and reporting, and like a lot of them reporting really, really low on a scale that up until relatively recently used to be pretty normally distributed. Like that's a big shift of people down to the low end of this scale that just never used to happen in older studies, in both my experience in my lab and in like other studies, as far as I can tell from reading other papers. So, that's quite a big shift. And I think what it marks is a shift away from that aggressive type of intersexual competition towards the more sisterhood types, where we're seeing intersexual competition manifesting as pro-female, pro-women ideologies and movements and supports like that. So the one thing so feminism is, it's quite a complicated ideology. It's not simple, and it has its different branches, and it has its internal inconsistencies and its debates. But the one thing that unites feminism is that it's reproductively suppressing. So you've got the different brands of feminism that are sort of united by being a devaluing of motherhood, a prioritization of career over motherhood, reproductive rights being very important in terms of access to abortion and things like that, but being much less important in terms of access to, say, reproductive fertility technology and things like that. So, what we're seeing is, only particular women's rights being motivated or being highlighted by different feminist movements, and the ones that are being highlighted are the ones that are effectively antenatal. Any kind of pro-natal movements tend to be largely stamped out. So there was quite a nice example of this a few months ago. I've kind of lost track of time, but a little while ago, Macron in France announced that he was, I think he ended up actually not doing this, but because of the backlash, but he announced that France's birth rate is declining like everyone else's. And as part of addressing that, he announced that he was going to make freely available to any woman who wanted it free fertility screening. And the idea is that because a lot of women are waiting until their mid-30s or even late 30s to have children, they're not discovering that they have fertility problems until they have very little time left to do anything about it. So his idea was that he would make this free fertility screening available so that women would at least know that if they were going to wait until their mid to late 30s to even try, they would know what their chances would be kind of by the time they got there. And there was a big feminist backlash against it. How dare he, you know, dedicate money to trying to trap women in oppressive motherhood when there are so many more important things, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, I don't think I've ever seen a feminist backlash to any kind of advancement of abortion law. It's just considered universally good. And it doesn't matter what the abortion is. Any loosening of restrictions around abortion is just universally good. Any increase of availability of fertility is you know, objected to and frowned upon. And that's what kind of unites, and that's kind of what I mean by the female intersexual competition is moving away from the antagonistic, you know, kind of overtly aggressive, nasty stuff, and it's now shifting more to a kind of pro-sisterhood where, you know, advising other women not to get married and not to have children is for their own good, because that will mean that they'll have a much more fulfilling career and be much happier, and, you know, so on and so forth. And so what it's doing is, and perhaps if I take one step backwards, one of the reasons why I think a shift from antagonistic stuff to, you know, an antagonistic method of intersexual competition versus a kind of method that has to leverage off pro-social motives is, as female intersexual competition is increasing in the population, which is what I think it's doing, becoming more and more intense, just like individuals high on psychopathy and sadism and those nasty traits, that those people aren't very common. If intersexual competition is going to become really widespread, then one of two things has to happen. It has to take a form that nice, normal, pro-social people are happy to engage in, or everybody has to become really nasty. One of those two things has to happen to allow female intersexual competition to become really widespread. And so that's why I think it's, you know, that's why I think I'm seeing that shift in the data, although I acknowledge that's pretty speculative. Like, that's really just me going, maybe that's it, and I don't have any other evidence that I'm right. But I do think that that's why we're seeing this kind of, you know, lower means, certainly, of female intersexual competition, but still really readily identified and increasing levels of female reproductive suppression, which is all leveraging off pro-social, pro-woman sisterhood motives, not leveraging off the nasty kind of, you know, high school level mean girl motives, because aside from anything else, there just aren't enough mean girls to support that kind of a system. So you've got to leverage off pro-social motives if you're going to see like widespread population reproductive suppression, or it's just not going to happen.
I mean, I would like to move towards a consideration of whether this is a hallmark of our times or whether it's something more deeply human. And if it's a hallmark of our times, is there precedent for that in the transition of different imperial civilizations in the past? Or, you know, because it seems like before we even had this conversation, I would have probably been swayed toward the perspective that we do live in a time of increasing jealousy and envy, and those are serious spiritual sicknesses in our civilization. But and you can unpack the different factors that might lead to that. But we're talking about human behavior as if it's like this, you know, feature of the machine, almost the feature of the human being. Sorry to call humans machines, but like it's built into the biology or something. So how much of this is the now versus, and how much is this contextualized by the world we live in and the acceleration of the features that have driven us into this more envious, jealous, you know, paranoid way of living?
So here's what I'll tell you what I think first, and then I'll tell you why I think it. So I think that this is not unique to the here and now. So I don't think there's anything especially special about the current circumstances. And I acknowledge that I probably differ a little bit from a lot of people who very readily accept that the modern world that we live in, for how quickly it has changed in such a short period of time, must have somehow created serious mismatches between evolved behaviours and the functions of those behaviours now. And I don't really adhere to that at all. That's sort of a bit of a separate conversation, which we can have if you're interested, but I don't really adhere to that. So what I think is actually happening is that there is a civilizational cycle, and this is not like, I'm not the first person who's observed this by a long way, right? So, a lot of people have observed that when civilizations fall, at least, they tend to have a lot of things in common. And the kinds of things that they have in common is birth rate decline, what we tend to call feminism, so greater female representation in the workforce, in civic duties, and in key institutions. They also tend to see another thing that we also see in our society and that we consider to be very progressive, and I'm sure in other civilizations and societies they also considered it to be very progressive, which is sort of what is effectively a decrease in the market price of sex. So sex becoming much more open, much more readily available, and much more common, and much less restricted. So far fewer social rules around when sex can and can't happen, and how it should be used. And other sort of other things that we sort of see civilizations having in common as they are weakening and declining and eventually collapsing. And so what I'm sort of positing, I won't say that I 100% believe this to definitely be true, but I don't think it's going to end up being very far away from accurate, is that when civilizations are building, you need to have very masculine men. Men need to do a lot of building, they need to do a lot of fighting. And building and physical work and fighting are very dangerous. So you need to have a lot of masculine men, and a lot of men are going to die. And male intersexual competition is very rife. And when male intersexual competition is very rife, you get a lot of sex and you get a lot of babies, and the population grows. As a result of that, you end up reaching a sort of accumulated level of societal wealth that results in a level of luxury. And we see this in the sort of the demographic shift, and we've sort of keep seeing it in country after country now, and it's historical as well, where what you get is, as a society gets wealthier, we see a mortality decline. It's mortality decline of everybody, but in particular mortality decline of babies. Now, if you're having 7 or 8 babies in the hope that 2 or 3 survive, all of a sudden, if you're going to have 7 or 8 babies and they're all going to survive, then that's not optimal, right? So people start having, so in response to mortality decline, fewer babies dying and more people growing up to become adults, then we see birth rates beginning to decline. Now, initially, that's not a problem because the declining birth rate, but the declining mortality, the population doesn't actually decline. However, what we then start to see is all of the things that we've sort of been talking about that we in our society have labelled feminism. We start to see women becoming less and less interested in motherhood and becoming more and more involved in occupations, vocations, civic duties, politics, institutions, also all manner of things. And this is not the West, this is just societies generally. So this happened in Arabic Empire in the 10th century, and it happened in Rome, and it happened everywhere else. Probably not everywhere else, I shouldn't say that, but it's happened a lot. And you see women becoming heavily involved and just spending less and less time on motherhood. And what you see is birth rates declining as a result. You see the institutions weakening as a result because the priorities in those institutions change. And eventually you see sort of population collapse and economic collapse. And rarely does a society collapse is actually allowed to fully collapse on its own, right? What happens is it usually falls in battle to to someone else and gets taken over. That's how most of the great civilizations fall, right? That's right. But the reason why I'm saying, it's actually saying the barbarians is actually really important, because what the civilization falls to is another civilization that is in a very different part of that curve, is in a part of that curve where the men are fighting and hunting and building and are very aggressive and are very masculine. And so then the whole process begins again. And so what drives the loop is that the women who are most influential and are driving these reproductive sort of suppression ideologies and norms are themselves still actually having babies. That's the kind of catch, right? So this kind of a reproductive suppression strategy cannot possibly be selected for if its end game is just societal collapse and everyone dies. That's a strategy that dies out the first time it appears, right? The only way something like this could actually evolve and be maintained is if the individuals who are driving it survive the population collapse, survive the bottleneck, and become the founder population for whatever rises from the ruins. And if they're the ones with the genes responsible for driving these ideologies, and they become the founder population for whatever rises from the ruins, then of course those genes will just spread and they will become, very, very strongly overrepresented in that founder population, which of course then sets that founder population on a path where it will ultimately end up following exactly the same strategies and exactly the same routes. And that's how that cycle just continues to go. And it's just driven entirely by individual level success at each stage of the cycle. That's effectively that's kind of the transition from from intersexual competition and reproductive suppression operating at a generation to generation level, and how it might actually be operating from a societal to societal level. I'm pretty confident. I don't think it's too controversial to suggest that the motives for reproductive suppression are linked to, that the motives for the birth rate decline, or a big part of the causal factor of birth rate decline, is reproductive suppression selected for by just normal evolutionary processes that reward those who have the greatest reproductive success. Where it becomes where I think what I'm saying becomes very contentious, certainly a lot more contentious, is whether or not the end game of societal collapse is what typically happens, or whether or not society reaches another turning point. So it reaches a turning point where, you go from male intersexual competition where the population grows and it just accumulates wealth and everything's just going great guns, and it hits a turning point where the men become a lot less aggressive and the women start competing, not necessarily physically aggressive, but they start becoming relationally aggressive, right? There's a turning point. Now, does this mechanism result in population decline to the point where society and its economy is sufficiently weakened that this does actually explain what was happening to other societies that fell under similar circumstances to the kinds of ones that we're experiencing in the West now? Or is it the case that we do see this general pattern I'm describing, but society reaches another turning point? There is another set of circumstances that results in birth rates picking up again and behaviours changing. So what I've kind of described sort of so far is, we have a particular circumstance with people behaving in a particular way, and that changes the society and the environment. Now, in a new environment, people behave in a slightly different way. So each time people are behaving like this, we're changing our own society. And in response to that society now being different, people then behave differently. So is it the case that, in fact, this current birth rate decline that we are watching around, and experiencing in all our own countries, is this in fact the ride down to the ground, or are we going to reach a point where something changes and thus behaviour changes and it picks back up and this is not actually the end? I'll be honest, I'm not especially optimistic, but that's probably the most contentious thing about what I'm suggesting. I think that's probably the weakest part of what I'm suggesting, that there's probably not, I'm not yet convinced, because I don't have enough knowledge about past societies to say that what looks like it's kind of similar based on the limited knowledge I have to what's happened in the past, that did definitely precede the end of those societies, because that's happened in the past and we know that they ended. We saw it ended, so we don't have to debate about whether that was leading into the end. It was. What I'm not yet confident enough to say with certainty is what I'm sort of describing that I'm thinking is happening now. Is that what was happening at the end of those societies too? It certainly has similarities.
It's a very different world in many ways, right? Like the fact that we're sitting here having a podcast that, thousands of people are going to participate and start thinking, there's a huge participation in our society in the intellectual space of, in some sense, engineering our own future. We have this ability to reconsider things in a way that just really doesn't have this kind of precedent, as far as I can tell.
You are absolutely correct, and I shouldn't smile, but the reason why I smiled is because greater participation in intellectual discussion is also one of the things that declining civilizations have in common. So
Interesting. Oh my
I know.
God.
So it is. No, but it's actually true. So a massive increase in what we now call knowledge work. People whose job it is to kind of think about stuff and fill out paperwork and
Well,
make records.
jobs, yeah,
And
jobs is
yeah,
different though. But jobs
but
versus people
also,
just taking interest.
But I
oh
think that
yeah,
this
and
links
so
back directly to the decrease in reproduction. Like, this is actually really funny. I hope like my dad my entire life was like, back in the day it made sense to have children, and now children are just,
Expensive.
parasites.
Yeah.
And so, which I'm like, he's well known for calling a spade, but it's like, in some ways it's true. If you work on a farm, children are a net boon. If you're doing physical labor, children are a net boon. If you're weaving in your house, still net boon. If you're in a society where everyone has moved away from physical labor, it seems pretty clear that, like, a child is a draw of resources that may or may not ever be useful to you. And that feels very cold and callous to say, because, like, the idea of bringing a child into the world and having this new, portal into consciousness that goes out and does incredible things is very powerful in and of itself. But if you assume that humans are these rational creatures that make a calculation of, okay, these are the resources that I have right this moment, this is the amount of resources that have to go into raising this child, and this is what I'm going to get out of it in the next 20 years, then it feels like that calculation in a society where you're not doing a lot of hard labor is pretty straightforwardly pointing downwards
yeah,
in terms
no,
of
no, no.
reproductive rates.
I get exactly what you're saying, and you're not. It's not that you're wrong. You're from that perspective, you're absolutely right. However, when humans consciously rationalize their behavior, that's usually unrelated to the reasons for that behavior. And there would always have been very strong selection pressure against any behavioral mechanisms that would lead individuals to just go, actually, let's just not reproduce. Let's just not. Because those individuals would not reproduce, and those mechanisms wouldn't survive. So we have to come up with an explanation for the birth rate decline that explains why individuals are choosing not to reproduce.
I mean, it seems plausible that it has to do with some kind of crowding signal.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a rat utopia here really hard. This is hard for me without to hear what you're saying without thinking of John Calhoun's experiments.
Yeah, that is true. But if we look at where the birth rate decline, it's happening in places that are not especially crowded. I mean, Australia is not especially crowded. Large parts of America are not especially crowded. Like, yes, okay, Europe and the UK, it's a bit harder to make those arguments about. The other thing with the sort of rat utopia situation is that we were able to sort of observe in that a number of clearly maladaptive and disorganized and high stress driven behaviors, whereas what is being described in people is not maladaptive or disorganized or sort of, signs of ill mental health type behaviors. And
I don't
or at
know. It's
least
really funny. We live in the country right now, and we will go into San Francisco or New York, these like very large, crowded places, and they feel very maladaptive. Like, I've told the story on the podcast before. So we were staying with our friends that lived in Dumbo. So it's a neighborhood in Brooklyn that's very, very posh and very populated. And so, I mean, everywhere in New York is crowded, but Dumbo is more crowded than average.
Right.
And so we get there, and Shiloh and I are going to go to the grocery store because we're going to cook dinner for them. And we start walking, and you're in this throng of people, and at some point we end up at this intersection where we have to cross the street, and there's literally there's a woman, this like wrinkled, old, palsied woman sitting in a wheelchair screaming, "Please help," over and over again in like a perfectly monotone screech, just over and over and over again. And I look back at her, and she's just sitting there, and she's got this like big gulp cup, and she's shaking it, and she's like, like she makes eye contact with me, and she's screaming like, "Please help." No one is looking at this woman. And we leave. She's still, like, we come back, she's still there. we go back to my friend's apartment, and I'm like, man, that was crazy. There was this woman. And they were like, oh, yeah, that's the please help lady. She's always there. And I'm like, I can't think of a more maladaptive situation than that.
Yeah.
Right?
But I mean, except though she stands out though because she's in the minority. Like if you went to Dumbo and like 95% of the people were standing there screaming, please help, then you would say like, okay, yes, we've clearly got like disorganized, social level disorganized behavior. But she's like one person and everyone else is like, yeah, that's the please help lady. I mean, yeah, we don't get it either. We get on with our day. Right. So, I mean, look, I guess what I'm trying to say about sort of the theories that I'm sort of positing is that they make, not trying to claim that they've not got problems or they're not critiquable or anything. That's not what I mean by perfect, but they do make perfect theoretical evolutionary sense of birth rate decline. And they make evolutionary sense of a bunch of the things that we're seeing happening in society that are going along with the birth rate decline, which are otherwise very difficult to account for. So it's quite difficult to account for why individuals would have been selected for, and women in particular, would have been selected for to, behave in ways in institutions that weaken those institutions. But if the ultimate end game is a population bottleneck, which you are going to be a part of, and thus, your lineages might be 1% of the population you're in. If you finish in that bottleneck, you will be the founder, you will be all of the lineages of the next population. So the evolutionary prize is enormous for bringing your own society down to its knees if you can be there at the end. And so what it does is it explains everything that's happening in a way that at least is like, it doesn't mean I'm right. It doesn't mean that I'm not wrong about something. That's not what I mean by perfect. But it does explain it in a way that accounts for a huge amount of what we're observing and doesn't rely on anything like, oh, humans are just behaving stupid now because the world's really model and it's different. And so all our evolved tendencies just don't work anymore because the world's just, it doesn't rely on any kind of vague throwaways of, oh yeah, that's just humans being weird. We can't explain that. We can't explain that. It kind of explains a heck of a lot and makes it evolutionary coherent. So what it means is not that I'm correct, but it means that if I'm wrong, at least we can have evolutionarily coherent accounts for why civilizations weaken and then die. And if it's possible to have those, mine might not be the right one, but there's probably other variations of it or other similar types of mechanisms that could be applying. So Ed Dutton's got one. We kind of tried to do a debate, and I don't think either of us moved like 1 inch in either direction. But I don't think we actually got into the details either. But he has a slightly different take that is much less about intersexual competition and much more about sort of dysgenic kind of purging and stuff, which I'm not quite sure is right. And I don't want to go into detail because I probably won't get his argument correct anyway. So I'm not the only person who's sort of suggesting that there is an evolutionary explanation for what's happening here, that you can understand it perfectly coherently without having to appeal to any kind of, get out of jail free cards, that some parts of human behavior just can't be explained. And some things are just maladaptive because this isn't the environment we evolved to live in, and sort of, throw away lines like that, which to me are always just like, go back and think harder excuses. You see it in animal behavior as well. Sometimes people go, oh, maybe you're just studying something that's not adaptive. And it's like, no, it is adaptive. I just haven't figured out exactly how it's working. It never turns out that something is just not adaptive. You're just not thinking about it right yet. Eventually, you always figure out what the animal system, whether it's its mating system or its social system, eventually you figure out what's going on. And you go, oh yeah, that really weird, stupid behavior that everyone told me that wasn't adaptive and I should just not study it. Turns out it is, and now I've figured it out. And it's the same with humans. There is an explanation. I'm not necessarily got it. I'm not saying I'm 100% right, and I don't, I'm not going to even change my own mind about it, especially as I read more about history, which is a rather embarrassing gap in my knowledge for someone talking about civilizational decline. But there is an explanation to what's happening. I might have a bit of it. I might have part of it. It might not be all of it, but there is an explanation. And if we can understand it, then maybe we can change the path that we're on. Maybe.
I love that.
Pardon the interruption, but I have to ask you for a favor. If you are listening to this podcast and you are enjoying yourself and you are enjoying the way that we encounter ideas, then consider coming over to patreon.com/DemystifySci. We have a really epic vision for what this podcast can be, and that includes recording in-person interviews, it includes hosting quarterly events, it includes really growing a live in-person community of people that are interested in the most pressing and important ideas of our time. If you have 75 cents a week that you can donate to this project, you can be a huge part of making this happen. And so I hope to see you over at patreon.com/DemystifySci. There's a couple of things that from this first segment that I really want to make sure that we really draw down. And so
Yeah.
the first thing that I see is that you're making an argument that the decrease in the birth rate is due to intersexual female competition.
Yes.
So what is the strongest evidence that you have to support that? Because that's like a pretty big assertion. And you've said before that like a lot of these ideas are distributed through various papers that are in progress and things that you've read and seen and experiments that you've done that haven't necessarily been published yet. But I think that because it's such a strong claim, it might be worth taking the time to kind of lay out something that's more than just, women being weird on motherhood forums or that degree of suppression. So,
Yeah.
what's your strongest case for the birth rate decline being due specifically to female competition?
So I think that there's sort of two questions there. One is about the empirical data, but the empirical data just links intersexual competitive motives within particular women to how they treat other women. So we know that some of the data that we've got is that women that are more intersexually competitive are more likely to engage with reproductively limiting social media messaging. So messaging that is antenatal, pro-abortion, what other categories? We had a few different categories of messaging. Those types of things. We know that they're also more likely to advise other women in reproductively inhibiting ways compared to what they say that they would do themselves. So I had the example where I saw that very specific example about breastfeeding, but in that same study we also looked at advice about having babies, when to return to work after having babies, even just basic advice about whether or not to pair up with someone in the first place. And then I did a separate study that was similarly an advice type study, and that was focusing, again, very much around that career motherhood sort of nexus. And again, it effectively replicated and showed the same findings. So women with higher intersexually competitive motives are more likely to give other women reproductively inhibiting advice, which is not what they say that they would do themselves. So in terms of empirically linking that within individual women, that's the kind of data that we're collecting at the moment to look at actually who are the women who are giving this type of advice. And they are the women who are more intersexually competitive. But to link that to birth rate decline requires, I think, a combination of theoretical arguments and large kind of multiple countrywide data sets and analyses, some of which I'm starting to do with a friend of mine who does that sort of thing. So he sort of has all those data sets, and this is sort of what he does. It's his line of research. He just analyzes all those types of large, data sets from the United Nations and the World Health Organization, sort of countrywide, multiple continent-wide statistics and things, and beginning to look at what in societies is associated with the birth rate decline. So we know from the demographers, we know about the change in mortality. We know that there's a pretty, I think it might be 10,000 US per capita or something, but there's a particular GDP which is very, very similar, across the world, as once a country's GDP reaches that particular level, you begin to see the shifts and the changes and the birth rate begin to decline. So it seems there's very strong evidence that whatever is going on, it's definitely linked to a country's wealth, or if it's not directly linked to wealth, it is linked to something else that very closely correlates with the country's overall wealth. So these are the kinds of empirical findings that I'm that I'm putting together and thinking about and considering. And then the other half of the equation that we haven't really spoken about tonight, but I think is also important, is also looking at what men are doing. So we've sort of spoken a lot about how, I'm suggesting that women are potentially sort of, getting more aggressive, but then actually as the birth rate decline becomes even steeper, and the female intersexual competition it moves away from being that competitive, aggressive competition and towards a more widespread suppression, then it takes on pro-social motives. And we haven't really spoken about what men are doing throughout this whole process. So if this was one alternative theory, say, is that nothing I've said about civilizational level mechanisms is correct, and all we're seeing is just runaway female intersexual competition. So, the consequences for civilization are not part of any broader system that has an evolutionary reward at the end of it. We're just seeing runaway female intersexual competition and reproductive suppression. If that were the case, then we would expect men to be selected for to fight back and to balance that. But that's not what we're seeing. So men are, typically speaking, not fighting back against feminism. In fact, feminism and all of its associated social norms have become very mainstream. So, in almost all, I think, progressive societies, the majority of both men and women support most feminist norms, equality of the sexes, and general disregard for traditional gender roles, equality of opportunity, no matter what the traditional gender roles might be between men and women, strong motivations for parity, so for parity of wages and salary and things like that. So all of these things that we know in societies are associated with birth rate decline are being embraced by both men and women. So if this were just runaway female intersexual competition, not a sort of society-wide mechanism, then we would expect men to be very strongly selected to pick up on cues to this and to resist it, to try to balance out. But that's not what we see. We see men actually behaving in such a way that they're fitting perfectly into this system, even to the point where we're seeing male testosterone levels declining over years and decades.
But isn't there's institutional reinforcement? I mean, it would be career suicide for a man to step up and say something publicly to counter any of those ideas that you listed. And so I have a hard time separating the evolutionary aspects from the just trendy institutional moments that we're in at any given point in time. You talked about feminism, but there's some other competing ideologies too that might be pointed at as well. And I wonder if you've considered, you kind of downplayed the rat utopia stuff because, this happens in places where the population isn't ballooning. But there's still this especially with the rise of interconnected media and the rate of transmission of ideas and shared ideologies amongst people, there's still a pervasively popular attitude that is in the spirit of the population bomb. I think it's taken a slightly different flavor now, which is more like humans are bad for the planet or something like that. But that's not exactly feminism. And I hear that one much, much more these days than I hear there's too many people, although they kind of play into the same feeder. So do is there a way to separate out the and maybe I'm missing something too. Are there other ideologies that are at play which reinforce population decline?
So there's definitely a few. I mean, certainly the climate, the climate change emergency has zeroed in on net zero, which is very destructive to institutions and certainly consistent with population decline. But the other thing that's I think that's important to be observed, and there's also feminism, and I guess one ideology that we haven't spoken about that is also very reproductively suppressing is also the whole transgender ideology as well, which is also very reproductively suppressing, which itself kind of arose out of sort of one branch of feminism, but it in itself has split the feminists. But it arose, it sort of had its its roots in feminist and queer theory anyway, so they're kind of not necessarily separate ideologies, but it's a branch of it. But what we can also see, what's also interesting to observe though, is what's been called the omnicause. So all of these sort of left ideologies that have this reproductive suppressing thing in common, they're all kind of coming together in quite rather discontiguous ways. So, and I guess the sort of classic example of that is probably like the Queers for Palestine. So, you know, that's a very illogical kind of movement. You know, that there is no part of the Palestine movement, and in fact, even they've been quite vocal about this, that is remotely sympathetic to gay people. And they do not want the support of gay people. And yet in the West, we see things like Queers for Palestine, where we sort of see the LGBTQ movement combining with the pro-Palestine movement. And then, of course, we sort of see this weird crossover where the poster child for the climate emergency is now becoming the poster child for the Palestine movement. So we're sort of seeing all of these causes kind of meld together, almost as if they do actually have a unifying motive, in that anybody who supports, not anybody, that's obviously an overgeneralization, but people who support one tend to be very likely to support the others, even when they are ideologically at odds, at complete odds with each other. And yet, because they're all leaning towards this same sort of, you know, civilizational decline, same type of thing, they're all rolling almost into what some people have been calling the omnicause, where the individual causes cease to matter much less than the intersection of all of them. And so it's not just feminism, and it's not just queer theory, and it's not just the climate emergency, or specifically the sort of anti-natal messaging that's beginning to grow up around the climate emergency. It's not just any of those things, but it's all of those things, and they're coming together and melding together. The differentiation between them is becoming less and less important.
So interesting, yeah. I wonder if we're going to see like LGBT for barbarians next or something.
I got distracted because I was looking at the TFR versus population density by county in the United States. Because if you look at
What was that acronym?
the total fertility rate versus population density, and it maps pretty cleanly. And the computer is frozen, so hopefully at some point I'll be able to show this. But it maps fairly cleanly, where the lower the population density, the higher the fertility rate. And so it's hard for me to see this as being not partially driven by... Okay, so I have an overarching theory here, which is that people spend a lot of time on the internet, and the internet is people's presence on the internet, I think, is skewed artificially, because there's some very, very small number of people that are the ones that are the posters and the participants in the conversation. And then there's a much larger swath of people that are doing the reading. So most people are kind of lost in the dark matter of the internet, where they're not really participants, they're just observers. On top of that, there's also the fact that the adoption of the use of certain types of social media, I'm thinking of like Twitter, which is probably the place where culture starts to foment, and then it it spreads out, because I feel like the culture war frontier is in these hyper fast social media spaces. I feel like the vast majority of the people that are driving the culture in those spaces are from these very, very dense places. They're from San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, and London, whatever other major cities. And so it feels like there is some part of the environment that we sample when we go on the internet, which is the psychological state of the people that are living in really dense environments. And so I don't doubt that there is mate suppression happening, because you see this across the board. Like there's tons of content that's being produced that is centered on the idea of you should have less children. the question really comes down to what is the germ of that impulse in the first place? And so your model is that the germ of the impulse is some sort of awareness of a future bottleneck that people are driving towards that will induce their lineage to survive while all of the other lineages die. And so can you kind of elaborate on how you tease apart the effect of density and the presence of these social media actors from dense locations versus this overall sensation of an impending crisis that we're speeding towards?
Okay, so I think a really important distinction is not that it's any kind of intrinsic awareness of an impending doom. So that's that's sort of a teleological explanation where you're requiring on something, you're sort of relying on something that hasn't happened yet, something that's going to happen in the future to be part of the causal explanation of something that's happening now. And that doesn't work evolutionarily. So the reason why, you know, under my theory, assuming it's correct, it may not be, but the reason why people are behaving like this now is not because of what this is going to cause. It's because people who behaved like this in the past were ultimately the survivors who were selected for, and their genes are now being carried in our population. So it's not that it requires any awareness of any pending doom or anything like that. It's not about that. What it is because evolution can't plan, right? Evolution doesn't select for traits because they will have a particular outcome. It has no there's no conductor of evolution. Like, it's not like an orchestra where there's someone at the front keeping everyone together and keeping everything coherent. Evolution is an entirely passive process. Simply those individuals, or more accurately, those genes that survived are the ones in the population. And so the people here now, or in any population, the individuals here now will grow and develop and mature and behave according to whatever they inherited from the individuals who survived and who have survived for many, many generations. So there's no need for there to be any awareness, conscious or subconsciously or anything like that, about any outcomes of this behavior. It's purely just when people are in this situation, this is how they behave. The consequences of that behavior is that we see birth rate decline. And so when you think about the ultimate explanation like that, what sort of comes out of that is that the rat utopia studies are much more likely to offer a mechanistic explanation for what's happened, not a functional explanation. So there are two different levels of explanation. So there's what are the actual mechanisms inside your body, the cognitive mechanisms, the physiological mechanisms that actually cause you to execute a particular behavior in the moment. That's one explanation of what causes behavior. But there's a whole nother explanation, which is what I'm interested in, which is, why do those mechanisms exist in the first place, and why do they behave like that? What functional outcomes did they previously have that means that they're the ones we have here now and not some other mechanism that makes people behave differently? And so if we think about the rat utopia studies, if putting rats in really dense situations, and the thing with those studies too, it wasn't just the density of situation, there were other aspects as well. So it was also really critical that these rats were given, had all of their needs met. And so
That's how they got so dense in the first place.
That's right. And so their entire sort of like the whole reward system in their brain kind of broke down because they didn't have that experience of needing something, getting something, and experiencing the reward because they just had everything. So you see a similar type of, like, mania is probably not a great word, but a similar type of just disordered behavior if you just put people in a sensory deprivation chamber. So when you put people in it, so, the human brain can only function by actually processing information coming in, whether that's in the form of light, sound, whatever. If you actually completely sensory deprived people, it doesn't take them very long for their brain to just not be able to function anymore. A brain can't sit there and be static, not be receiving any input. And so what they did, it wasn't just the population density that was a problem, although obviously that then became a problem, but it was also a complete disruption of the reward system pathways. And so it might be that the rat utopia system, or what we observed rather in that whole series of experiments, is not completely mechanistically unrelated to what we see in human populations that reach a certain level of societal wealth, in that there is also clearly a big change that happens, or maybe no, gradual change rather than a big change, but clearly that is going to make a change to the rewards pathway and a change to, you know, what kind of feed-in all of those mechanisms are getting, and then we get different behaviour. So it's not that, is this a civilizational level effect, or is it just, you know, that there's just too many people? Part of the way this civilizational effect happens might be because people do have some things in common with rats, and when you change the reward system and you have, you know, a certain level of reproduction, a certain size of population, that is one of the triggers that, you know, causes people's behavior to change. Remember I said earlier that sort of what I'm effectively supposing is that we have this situation which causes a certain set of behaviours, and that leads to this situation which causes a certain set of behaviours which leads to this situation. Maybe there are parallels to be drawn between those situations and the behaviours that they then cause to take place, and what we were sort of seeing on some mechanistic level. There might be overlaps in what we saw with the rats, but that's not necessarily an argument against what the functional consequences of those behaviours in those circumstances are, and the fact that what we inevitably see is a birth rate decline, which is, I mean, it's only going to have a couple of possible outcomes. One is it just hits the ground, and we start seeing genuine societal collapse, or at least in, you know, within certain areas, or something turns it around, or some sort of unknown third option, sort of involving, you know, mixing of societies. So, you know, a society might not completely collapse, but individuals come in from elsewhere who, you know, which sort of happens, or which is already sort of happening to some extent, in that in most countries, immigrants have higher birth rates than the native population. That lasts for a couple of generations. So we're sort of seeing that anyway. And so what we might see is massive migration on a really big level happening. And that's how we kind of get out of this birth rate rut. That might be the thing that sort of happens, but there's really only a few outcomes from here on in. Something intrinsic to the society turns it around, nothing turns it around and it crashes, or a bunch of people come in from elsewhere and that turns it around, because those people are behaving differently anyway. There's not many other ways out from where we are now. There's only so many things.
Well, so, I mean, I think that the reason that the rat utopia stuff is so interesting is because the question is, so like the way that I see the pieces fitting together is that there is a decline in the birth rate. The decline in the birth rate is driven in, so let's say that there's some density related feature that is the trigger for it, but then once you have the density related trigger for it, there's all of these behaviors that appear in the population that are runaway behaviors that perpetuate and accelerate the situation. And so if we point to feminism being the cause and the downfall of, or the cause for the decline in the birth rate, then we have one set of solutions to offer for that, which is, well, if feminism is the problem and the emancipation of women is the problem and the education of women is the problem, well, then the obvious choice is to remove all of those things from society.
Get them back in the kitchen.
Yeah, exactly. Right? To like return to this world of barefoot and pregnant. And I'm like, okay, maybe. But if there's right, because I mean, like, if we accept that having a high birth rate is really, really important, and we identify the underlying cause of it as being the emancipation of women, then there's not really an alternative to removing the emancipation of women, right?
Higher death rate.
I don't think
More
that
women
necessarily
soldiers,
works.
more
though.
wars. I'm sorry.
No. See, the thing is, I don't think that necessarily works, because even if even if we say theoretically, I mean, obviously there's a whole host of reasons why logistically we actually couldn't do that. I mean, if we tried, women would not let it happen. So it's not, I think logistically and culturally it's not a viable solution, even if theoretically it would work.
I've come across a tremendous number of women on the internet, and maybe they're just bots, but they're like, yeah, take away the vote, like prevent women from becoming educated. Like there's a weird cultural current that seems to embody this idea.
There is to some extent, but I think the comment about someone daring to say something like that seriously and in public would be the end of your career, I think is probably still a more accurate description of what would happen to somebody trying to actually do something like this, right? I don't think that a movement of women or anybody, in fact, in favour of this is anywhere near large enough to give it any kind of legs. And there's also, which is something else that we could also talk about just on its own for 3 hours, but the phenomenon of this social policing of what you can and can't talk about is incredibly strong. And, so we've got this concept of the Overton window, and it's very difficult to explain how people know what they aren't and aren't allowed to say, and how people perceive that appears to have changed, and all of a sudden you can say. So it's a fascinating phenomenon all of its own, but it very strictly polices the implementation of certain social norms, and it makes it almost impossible to break them down. But the reason why I think what you're suggesting wouldn't even work theoretically, even if we could do it, even if culturally we could somehow make it happen, is because all we would be doing would be going back in time, or changing the state of society back to a particular point. But the fundamental nature of people would be the same, which means that particular society would create the same behaviours it created before, and that would move us to this society, which would result in the same behaviours we had before, which would move us to this society, and we would just end up in the same place we're in now. We might stave that off for a few generations, but if all we do is try to just go backwards to where we were, even if we could do that somehow, we would just end up coming forward to here before too long anyway. So I don't actually see that as a solution. If there is a solution to this, we have to actually disrupt this cycle. So if we sort of imagine that we've moved through some societal conceptual space along this trajectory, well, we need to find out what society looks like when we put it up here, or when we put it down here. We need to take it off this trajectory and see how people behave. Right, we need to put society somewhere where it's not just going to move through this cycle all the time, which means it's not a matter of undoing things that we've done. It's a matter of working out how can we arrange it so completely differently that we just don't get these types of behaviours. I'm not sure that sort of theoretical, conceptual space actually exists for a real society. I don't know what that society would look like and whether any of us would want to live there. But theoretically, I think that is the only solution. Find a society that is not anywhere on this trajectory, which means it doesn't look like what we look like now, and it doesn't look like anything in, rather recent memory from before the birth rate began to decline, because all of those ones just have the same endpoint. So we need to find something entirely different. What that would look like is quite difficult for me to conceive of. I can't honestly say that anything really springs to mind, but that's what the solution will look like if indeed there is one.
That is the most rational argument for a progressive mindset that I've ever heard before. I think it is really the strongest argument, but it's different than defaulting. I think that either side of the political alley defaults to some reversionist idea of how things worked better in some either idealized past or some historic past. And I think that that's a really good point is, and I guess this is why I kind of want to circle back to this thing about intellectual participation being portentous, because I feel like we're in a particularly unique position to be able to put all of our heads together and imagine what comes next in a way that doesn't look like what came before. But you're saying
I think you're right.
Yeah.
I think you really are right about that. I think if there's one spark of optimism in this whole sort of otherwise rather depressing tale that I'm telling, if there's one spark of optimism, it is that every society is unique. So even if we can find commonalities between past societies and ours, that doesn't necessarily mean that, they couldn't escape what happened to them, therefore we can't escape what is potentially happening to us. It doesn't follow logically, right? Every society is in fact different. So even if we can spot patterns and look at history and go, actually, that she seems to be right, that sucks. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's set in stone. And, what our society has, more than anyone that's come in the past, which is true of every other society, but it's never, and it hasn't saved them in the past, but is technology and knowledge, right? So when civilizations collapse, we frequently lose. That is one thing that gets lost, right? So we often lose technology and knowledge when civilizations collapse, and we've lamented the loss of that, many times. But nevertheless, every society that comes up, and now it's us, has more technology and more knowledge than other societies had at their disposal to try and solve this problem, which means that, no one may, there are no past societies that still exist by definition. So none of the ones that are gone solved this problem, but none of them had the technology and knowledge that we have. So we don't know what our odds are of surviving this problem or resolving it or coming up with an adequate solution, but they are better than what the odds were for any other past society. So
really
they still might not be very big, but they're better.
I think, I think that the defining feature of this moment from an optimistic standpoint is the interconnectivity of individuals. Like, you don't have to be a professional philosopher to contribute to the discussion that's happening. Like, that it's never been an outsider's world like it is right now in some sense. And there's going to be all sorts of institutional suppression, and those are problems for sure. But I see it as a really, really unique moment, right? We had, obviously the printing press was huge, writing books, people being able to educate themselves. Like, this isn't a brand new thing, but the scale of the interconnectivity is completely without precedent as far as I can tell.
Well, and I also think that if density does have an effect, and I think that it's hard to argue that it doesn't, because you go to big cities and there's fewer children than there are when you go to rural places. You can look at this data. Then the solution seems straightforward. Like, figure out technologies that allow people to disperse and also support the development of rural areas. Like, why do people concentrate in cities? It's because they're cultural nexuses. There's restaurants, there's art galleries, there's things happening. And so there's this attractor to being in those places. And you go out into a rural community and there's not really music. There's not really culture. There's not really stuff to do. There's not restaurants.
Really culture.
We did find a record store out here yesterday.
Yeah, we did.
Finally.
But it's true. There's 2 good restaurants in a town of 20,000 people.
They are really good, though.
They are very good. But it's
So what cities have that, what larger cities have that smaller cities don't have, is economies of scale, right? That's what allows there to be so many nice restaurants and such diversity of restaurants and, diversity of other entertaining luxuries, arts and record shops and whatever it might be, right? So it's that benefit of economies of scale that allows cities to have all these things that regional towns can't offer, because they just haven't got enough people to support it. So I suspect that economies of scale, I imagine, without being an economist or a demographer, but I imagine that economies of scale also benefits the individual people living in those places as well. So yes, real estate costs are higher, but you got to imagine people dispersing themselves as being like an optimality problem. So you get a lot of economies of scale in big cities, but the cost of actually living there, the cost of property is higher. And so that price differential of the property is the balancing out of the economies of scale that you lose. You go to a regional town, the property is much cheaper, but then other things end up being more expensive. And so humans kind of arrange themselves in dense clusters and less dense clusters, and it's effectively just an optimality problem. And then property prices then reflect the demand for property in this area versus property in that area, and how people trade off the economies of scale they get here versus what they miss out on over here. So I'm not quite sure that forcing even if population density is one of the key triggers of these types of behaviour, I'm still not quite sure that attempting to force people out to disperse more is necessarily going to help, because I think you will still get local optimality. You will still get, people attempting to solve that optimality problem by coming together to create economies of scale. And ultimately, I don't know, maybe you can sort of get a really well-controlled city planner or something, but I suspect that would be a difficult thing to completely undo, because people will just come together for those economies of scale again. The reason they came together in the first place, the reason why we're not uniformly spread out. We've had, most countries have got their entire country to spread themselves out in, and that's not what they do. They, well, certainly, the United States and Australia are great examples where, the majority of people live on a tiny minority by surface area of the available land in the country.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this points to something else that you were saying, which is that it's a problem that tends to recur, where it's like,
Yes.
even if you were to shift things to a different condition over enough time, it just reverts back to the state beforehand. Which kind of leads me to something else I wanted to ask you about, which is that a lot of the times when you look at the decrease in the fertility rate, people are comparing with, the 1950s, and they're like, man, it's really gone down. But then if you look at the trend from maybe like 1900s onward, the 1940s through the 1960s are this huge anomaly. Like, you see the curve start to decline. In 1900, you get the baby boom, and then it starts to decline after that's over. And so I'm like, do you think that the same principle of intersexual mate suppression has been operating since the 1900s and started to play out even 100 years ago? Or do you think that this is something new and different and recent?
I don't. The main reason why I don't think it's something new and different, I've looked at those same curves, and I'm also not sure on the role that just World War II then played in the subsequent, because of just how many people were killed. So I suspect that there's also a human, a triggering releaser in war that leads populations, because of course whether you win or lose a war, you lose a lot of men, and it's time to rebuild. So I suspect that World War II was a massive factor in the subsequent baby boom that happened, and so that may be enough to explain the anomaly. I'm not sure if it actually is, but the main reason actually why I think that the mate suppression stuff is sort of predates just the last, whatever it might be, whether, sort of got the sexual revolution in the 60s and 70s, but then we got the suffragettes much earlier than that. So it's hard to pinpoint where you might want to say this started. But because the same thing is apparent in other very, very different cultures and societies going back in time, leads me to think that whatever the particular mapping in our culture, I don't think that it's just appearing very recently and is not explaining birth rate declines previously. So I was reading John Grubb, maybe, might be his name. I forget. He wrote quite a famous little essay on the sort of rise and fall of civilizations and what we can learn from that. And one of the things he observed is that one of the sort of complaints of Rome at the end was that Rome was run by women. So there was, dissatisfaction with the presence of women. And he also notes that in other societies, I think he has about 10 that he uses as like case study examples. And he observes that an increase in women in the institutions is always a very reliable precursor to the decline of those institutions and then the economy and then ultimately the society. So it is a repeating pattern. However it's played out for us on this particular occasion, we could probably, have really interesting discussions about the roles of war and other conflicts and other social movements. And obviously we've got probably a very unique situation in that we have much more cross-cultural influence and interference than has ever been had in the past because of the, basically since the internet, we've got so much influence now coming from one part of the world to a completely different part of the world that's a much more difficult puzzle to unravel. But because it's one of the sort of the common themes that sort of keeps appearing in very, very different societies to what we have now, that suggests that we're probably not going to find the root of it in anything that's special about our modern time. That's going to help explain how it played out for us, but it's clearly not a special requirement for it because it's happened in other very different parts of the world in very different times.
Well, I think the really shocking piece of this puzzle for me is that this institutional suicide is somehow evolutionarily adaptive for the women participating in this kind of cultural suicide. That's what's freaking wild. I think that's at the crux of the argument that's really radical, is that the women carry their genes on past the barbarian incursion.
Yeah.
And the men, I mean, they don't really, play into this story as much.
Well, I think the thing is, though, I think that the men, the genes, the lineages carried on by those women, there's just as many male lineages carried on there. Like every offspring is the result of one man and one woman. So the male lineages are being carried on too. I think what's interesting about the male role in
presumably
this,
the barbarian lineage, the male barbarian lineage, or whoever's coming in to displace
from that perspective, yes. But within the women, they had fathers, right? So the lineages of those fathers are being carried on through their daughters. So what's interesting about the role that men are playing is that there's very little evidence of, sort of organized, sort of, male sort of sex group level resistance to what's going on. Instead, what we're seeing largely is, is men being, I won't say quite as enthusiastic, but men are certainly playing a role in, in these institutions as well. And there isn't a huge sex divide around the policies of these institutions. Men are getting on board with the, what are sort of associated with the more feminized policies in these institutions. And men are definitely getting on board with those. It's not like it's just a female driven thing. And the men are like, well, what's going on? That they're very much active players in it. So, they too are attempting to, I guess, be the fathers of daughters who will become the founders of the next population. So, they're also hoping for a spot courtesy of their daughters in the founder population as well. And so it's not just the women who are benefiting from it. It's also, the men are playing a part of this. We're not seeing, if it was just, like I said before, if it was just isolated female, runaway stuff that sort of had got itself in some kind of a loop it couldn't get itself out of, you would expect heavy selection pressure on men in those circumstances to drag their society back out of that. And we don't see that. If anything, we actively see the opposite. And that's,
God, I love how this rationalizes something that I often hear people throw their hands up like, why are these institutions committing suicide? Like, why would they ever? Like, they've gone crazy. It's just insanity and everybody's lost their minds. And it's like, well, there actually might be some selective pressures for that to happen.
Well, there's a weird thing that's kind of operating in the background here too, which is that the highest fertility rate cohorts are the wealthiest ones. Like if you look at, by income decile, if you're making more in the United States, I think the highest fertility rate is among those making more than $700,000 a year, which is like obviously a very small fraction of the society, but it seems like you can also parse this not just in like.
Well, historically, the elite classes tend to be co-opted by their conquerors too, right? So it's like you will kill off some portion of like the governors and stuff, but like you'll often also take the leaders from the elite from that conquered society and install them because it's a lot easier to, bring a society into your dominion if you can adapt the elite of that society to it. So there is like an actual ongoing class war that has evolutionary roots as well.
Yeah.
it's also really interesting because, again, the only way that this could work is if people with a fair amount of social influence who are actually have the power to drive these types of ideologies, implement these ideologies, police them, and punish anyone who dares to deviate, if those are the people who are ultimately at the end. And so it makes sense that even though historically for quite some time it's been poorer people actually having more children, that is starting to change. As we're seeing, people having fewer and fewer children, we are seeing emerging at the top the higher fertility rates, as you say, amongst those elites who are the ones who have to be the enforcers of this type of a strategy, because without their support it couldn't go anywhere. If there was no such thing as you lose your job if you say that, then people would you would be much harder to convince people to go along with a lot of stuff, right? People go along with a lot of stuff because of the consequences of not going along with it. And so it has to be people with a certain level of, not necessarily wealth, but it correlates with wealth, having social status and some sort of social influence. So it's not necessarily wealth, but that's going to be a fairly good predictor of it.
Well, the wealthy people are certainly propping up the institutions. I mean, if you've worked, anybody who's worked in science is writing grants to, there's some money from the government, but increasingly less. A lot of these private foundations come from super elite elements of the society, right? Like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and, Soros and like all this stuff, right?
And there's also the fact that the information sphere that everyone is exposed to is not neutral. Like, it's well known that there's ideas that are allowed to propagate, ideas that aren't allowed to propagate. And so I wonder if there isn't some sense where there's a hyper-fertile elite quartile or decile of the population that is more or less immune to whatever is in the channels. And
I think,
maybe are they the ones that are practicing the mate suppression and their signaling is getting boosted? Like, what do you think is happening there?
So I think that is not too far from it. So it does seem to be that if you sort of think that there's got to be people who are like, this is effectively a competition, and the majority of people are not going to win. That's the game that's been set up, right? If the whole idea is to drive to a bottleneck, then the majority of people are simply not going to win. They're not going to be left at the end. And it does seem that the individuals who are most likely to embody these types of ideologies, so actually enact them, so actually not have children when they say that, you shouldn't have children because of the climate, and they actually don't have children, and, various other examples of similar themes. It does seem to be people who tend to be lower on mate value and have less wealth, less status. So it does seem like the individuals who are perhaps evaluating that they're very unlikely to be, left at the end, and so their role in all of this is to just go along, not rock the boat, not try anything, just sort of go along to get along, in the hope that, I guess, they will have some inclusive fitness from, relatives of theirs who might be left at the bottleneck. But certainly they've got nothing to gain by trying to disrupt the process, even though they're less likely to win. So it seems that we have people who's perhaps, it's a little bit like grandmothers, how grandmothers are sort of past their own reproductive period, but they still have an opportunity to influence their inclusive fitness by influencing the fitness of their children and their grandchildren and their relatives and things like that. So they're no longer interested in their own fitness, they're kind of past that, but there's still things they can do to influence their inclusive fitness. It seems like women who self-evaluate and women who sort of there was a really interesting fad for a little while where women were getting their fallopian tubes cut out and sort of advertising that, and sort of say, oh look, I've gone and done it, I'm free, I'll never be hampered by having children, and that kind of became a fad. And you would think that that's reproductively speaking, that's an extraordinary own goal, and the only thing that makes it not that is if that person had a relatively low likelihood of reproductive success anyway. And in an unusual situation where birth rates are declining and the majority of people in the population are not going to have reproductive success, then the selection pressure to not do things like that drops away. So in these circumstances, you do see these types of, in circumstances, theoretically, in circumstances of sort of, very narrow reproductive success in terms of a narrow band of the population is actually going to continue each generation, you do start to see relaxed selection pressure and you do see these really maladaptive type things emerging, which I guess is not that dissimilar to the rats again. We're coming back to the rats.
Oh, it's hard to avoid the rats, right? Because I think that you just said something so interesting, right? Because it's a situation where reproductive success is already low. Like that's the pre-existing condition. And if that's the pre-existing condition, then I feel like all of these strategies that you're describing are the result of something that is some like shadow that's being cast on the society. And I'm like, where does that shadow come from? Because the fact that the birth rate started declining in 1900 as opposed to staying constant is fascinating to me, because I'm like, that's more than 100 years old at this point.
Yeah.
And that's also when people started to move to cities. I know that this is
Mhm.
Hmm?
Is it?
I think so. I mean, I think that that's the kickoff of the industrial
I
age.
think cities have been focal feature of many civilizations for thousands of years.
But I think that the transition away from largely living in the countryside to largely living in the cities was completed by 1930. And so, you don't think so?
I'm just thinking of, like Teotihuacan and Rome
Dead
and
civilization, dead
no,
civilization.
dead, yeah, but it's a feature that crops up cyclically.
It's a feature that crops up cyclically, and I'm like, it seems reasonable that that is also deeply tied to the fall of those civilizations, because when you concentrate everybody in one place, I think mimetic contagion becomes an immensely powerful force that starts to drive these sorts of weird behaviors, and then maladaptive behaviors that would otherwise be excised from the population are able to propagate. And so
The
it
other
seems
thing that's been observed as well is that large levels of migration into big cities is also seen as a reliable precursor. So one of the other things that I'm sure it was John Grubb, I hope I've got his name right, talked about in his essay was also, looking at a lot of these big ancient cities, they became very multicultural towards the end of those civilizations as well. So, very welcoming and multicultural in a largely positive way. So very welcoming of investors, very welcoming of foreigners, very welcoming of travelers, that kind of thing. So that kind of sort of, bent towards multiculturalism, which doesn't bode well for us again in the West, but that bent towards multiculturalism also is one thing that's been identified, which is also not entirely inconsistent with big cities, because and population density being one of the important cues, because populations can get very dense very quickly, much more quickly with immigration than they can with natural, birth rates exceeding death rates. So density, even if it's not about absolute density, it might be about, changes in density over short periods of time, because certainly immigration can achieve that in a way that natural birth rates, at a speed that natural birth rates can't. So that also is an observation that's somewhat in favour of density being a key part of this process as well.
The reason I was smiling at the end of your comment, Nasia, is because you said these maladaptive behaviors, and I was like, wow, the whole argument here is that they are adaptive at the end of the day, which is what's really creepy about this entire thing. I feel like that there's a real, it's really easy to make Darwinism a religion too, and think that these natural forces that are operating in the background are somehow value positive too. It could be, right? It's not necessarily just because this is the way the natural world operates that's something that we want to lean into as well.
Precisely.
I think we have to be really careful about that, especially as scientists who want to be like, well, this is the way it is. It's like, well, You know, it
No,
doesn't.
that's
We're
right.
designing our
It's
future too.
yeah. I mean, and that's exactly right. So one thing that's important to remember is that the only currency that evolution cares about is reproductive success, inclusive fitness. It doesn't care about longevity. It doesn't care about happiness. It doesn't care about comfort. It doesn't care about anything except how that thing translates into inclusive fitness. And so the things that we care about as people are just irrelevant to evolution. And so that's why it's important to understand, I think, what's happening and the mechanisms that are at play, but it's also important not to moralize those. It's, it's not like the like, what is it? The what is natural is good fallacy, right? It's important not to presume that there is any intrinsic good or bad about the way the world is. It wasn't, I'm probably going to annoy a whole bunch of people here, but it wasn't designed by a benevolent God who tried to make it wonderful for us. It just is. And it is because of a completely undirected, blind process of evolution that was not designed by anybody to make people happy or to make anything nice. And so
on the other
world
hand,
can be awful.
We do have that benevolent ability. Like
Exactly,
we
that's
actually
right.
can be that benevolent force in
Exactly.
the universe, or at least we can embody it in our best on a good day.
Yeah.
Right? Each of
Yeah.
us. And honestly, institutionally, as we reconstruct these institutions or as we look towards a future that doesn't suffer the same ills, right, for as many people in the population.
Exactly.
I mean, right.
That's why there's
that's pretty cool, actually.
Yeah.
And unique for humans.
There's
To add a little bit of data to this urbanization question. So in 1800, less than 10% of people lived in urban areas. By 1900, it was 40%, and by 1920, it was 50%. And so there was this dramatic increase, at least in the United States.
In
and
the
I think
US,
that
yeah.
the urbanization also continued along similar paths in countries that were being industrialized at the same time. And so, like, it's hard to, I wonder if there isn't some kind of density switch that happens inside of humans, because it's so common in biology for there to be density switches.
Look, it certainly
Time to
could
slug.
be.
Yeah, like, do you know the slime mold Dictyostelium discoideum?
I know a few things about slime molds doing stuff. What do they do in terms of density?
So this one's amazing.
This one's amazing. So they're free-living single-celled amoebas that if you seed them onto a plate, they spread out, they cover the entire plate, and when they hit a critical density, they get this like signal to slug, and they come together into this single organism that moves around the plate like a slug, and then it finds some optimal nutrient density, and then it sends up this gigantic stalk that has spores on the end of it, and only the cells that are in the spore body itself are the ones it then disperses, and the entire process starts again. But they're the only ones that survive.
But they're the only ones that make it.
The slug dies. They're the only ones that make it.
Okay.
And so I'm just like,
and all the other lineages die out.
They do. And so it's like, it's weird because like I feel like there's this crazy thing inside of biology, which is density signals. Like I studied microbiology for my doctoral dissertation, and it was like astounding the degree to which there's density dependent coordination inside of organisms, to the point of like fully remodeling yourself, sacrificing yourself for the whole, new behaviors, new genetic programs that get activated. And I feel like when it comes to humans, we've been really, really, really reluctant to look into that, because I think that it undermines the entire system. If you're like, hold on a second, maybe concentrating in cities is actually leading to all of these ills. There's not an easy option that's available on the other side to say, okay, well, we can have civilization without cities. It's like, I don't think that you made this case about the economies of scale and distribution and everything else. Like, I don't think that we've solved that. But at the same time, if that is the repetitive cycle that we always hit upon, which is that humans do have some kind of density feature that gets turned on when we get into sufficiently dense urban environments, then there's no way for us to avoid it if we don't actually look it in the eyes and start to integrate it into our models for what's happening. Because it seems like this is the crisis that returns time and time and time again. There's tons of ancient empty cities that anthropologists are like, it's really weird, they just left.
Yeah.
There's no sign of where they went.
it's a really good. I think it's a really good observation. Not that I'm necessarily trying to counter it, because the more I think about it, the more I think that density may be. We know that it correlates very strongly with GDP, so it is about wealth. But as I said before, it's either about wealth or it's about something that correlates very strongly with wealth. And so understanding how density correlates with wealth is probably a really important thing to understand as well. And also there's a whole host of other things, which doesn't mean that density is not pretty kind of primary in the causal chain, and these are also downstream consequences of it. But there are also a lot of other interesting differences between big cities versus regional towns that are also at least sort of coherent with the ideas that we're talking about. So the big cities are also the ones that are more progressive. And of course, it's the more progressive politics that are pushing the more antenatal views. And so if we think of political orientation as being, and this is somewhat of a simplification, but if we think of political orientation as being sort of the left progressives and the right conservatives, then there's a lot of things that progressives and conservatives differ on that becomes quite coherent in the context of thinking that that conservatives are effectively trying to slow down the civilizational kind of decline, and progressives are sort of trying to speed it up. And so as you get closer and closer to it, if you it's almost like if you imagine like a roller coaster, right? And it sort of goes up and it goes over the peak, and when enough of it goes over the peak, it starts falling, which is why civilizations in total get more and more progressive as they go further and further along, and left-wing governments become more left-wing, or rather left-wing parties become even more left-wing, and conservative parties become even more centrist, and everything shifts kind of in that direction. And then so one of the sort of big differences between, or there's a few that sort of feed into it, between the left and the right that I'm really interested in, is that I think that the left encapsulates like a strategy to minimize the price of sex, and the right is attempting an antagonistic strategy to maximize the price of sex. So which is why the right and the conservatives are associated with not wanting sex outside marriage, and or sort of generally being much less in favor of public nudity and television shows about sex and racy sort of stuff, and that's all associated with progressive views, movements towards really skimpy bikinis and all of those types of things, right? All of the increasingly sort of visibility of the body and sexual cues and things, and also the sexual, obviously, the sexual revolution is an obvious one, but again primarily in women we're seeing much greater endorsement of casual sex from liberal women than you see from conservative women and things like that. So, from that perspective, it kind of makes sense that the political continuum is almost like a sort of like people stretched out in time. Like the progressives at the front are the ones that are kind of picking up cues of the state of civilization being mostly towards this end, and conservatives are the ones who are picking up cues, and our civilization is still back here. The most adaptive strategy is still to be a little bit more conservative about that, and then over time you just see that tipping down and to become ever more progressive. And that then is also interesting that it's the big cities that are more progressive than the regional towns. So they're the ones where people are picking up the cues that civilization is moving further, which is also consistent with your argument that density is a key part of it.
This makes me think of an axis that I've kind of started to notice just by watching the culture wars, which is like bioconservatism on one hand, which is that there is this civilizational way that we ought to be, that there is a traditional mode of existence that has always served us, and we should maintain that at all costs. And on the other side is the transhumanist approach, which is that the old ways of being are no longer serving us, and so we must force our evolution into some new, as yet unexplored space. And it really is fascinating because you can really bin like left and right also into the sense of like bioconservative and transhumanist. And that gives it this like very, I don't know, it's an interesting like civilizational lens to it, because it's like what are we trying to choose between? And I think that what we're really trying to choose between is, do we just try to go back in time and restart the cycle and end up exactly in the same place? Or are we really trying to say, okay, look, we have enough intellectual capacity to be able to like ratchet to some different starting point? And
Yeah.
I honestly, like, I know that humans aren't supposed to be evolving, but I see it as a moment of speciation.
I mean, humans. I think really are still evolving. I know I've heard people say, and that's one of sort of Ed. It's not really his argument. I shouldn't sort of attribute it to him too much, but he sort of said something similar. I'm hearing his voice in my head going, "No, I didn't. That's not what I said." But it's exactly what he says. Not exactly what he said. Sorry. And but I've lost my train of thought now. What was it? I was going to say something about something that he said that was consistent with yours. Yeah. That's what I was going to say. Yeah, it's a little bit like, it almost kind of reminds me in a way like the transhumanists, not really sure what they're headed towards, but really confident that it's going to be something. And it kind of reminds me of that sort of silly old joke where like I don't know, there's some setup to it. Basically, someone's going to see a psychic, and the psychic says, "Oh, I can't see anything beyond like next week for you. I think you're going to die. You need to get your affairs in order anyway." So, person goes and gets their affairs in order, and the week passes, and they don't die. So they sort of go back to the psychic to tell them I didn't die, and then they discover that the psychic died. That's why they couldn't see anything beyond next week. And I think it's kind of like, it's like an analog of the transhumanist thing. If they think they're pushing towards this sort of, wonderful, magnificent new thing, and what their strategy is actually pushing towards is oblivion, but they're just not realizing it yet. Like at least societal oblivion, but certainly not genetic oblivion. I mean, they're the ones that are going to be there at the end, right? So, they're not pushing for genetic oblivion. They're the ones that are going to win. But yeah, it just reminded me of that. So it's quite a similar kind of thing. So optimistic, and what all their strategies are leading to, or at least what they've all led to in the past, is like the end. So, but that's a little bleak.
Well, artificial wombs, I think that there is this great faith that technology will save us. And I don't necessarily know that that's a solid, like, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that the transhumanist, super progressive side of the scale is pushing towards something that they don't really know how it's going to work out, and that we do have these tried and true strategies. But at the same time, I'm like thinking about the people who left the old worlds to come to the new world, and you could make the same case for that. You leave everyone you know, the place that you've evolved in for millennia, and all of a sudden you're going to get on a boat to go starve at Jonestown, or it's not Jonestown. Sorry,
Bad example.
Jamestown, whatever.
Jonestown's not a good example. But I mean, look, Musk is trying. I mean, Musk is trying to do that right now. I mean, he wants to. That's his goal, right? He wants to start an entire new civilization on Mars. I mean, it's extraordinarily brave. I've got no way of judging the probability of success. I just can't possibly know that. But yeah, imagine being someone who's actually going to take that. Like, it's a one-way journey, right? You're not coming back. Oh. I find it quite uncomfortable to even think about. I guess it's not going to be me that goes. I'm clearly not got the right personality for that. But I find that, yeah, it's how like when, like, I don't know if you're scared of heights at all, so maybe this doesn't apply. But I'm never used to be. But as I get older, I'm becoming increasingly fearful of heights, and it's really getting annoying. It's stopping me from doing stuff. But sometimes even if I see like just a picture that taken from really, I'll get like almost a little adrenaline rush. And I get that when I think about people going to Mars as well. It's just, it actually like gets a visceral response from me. The thought of it is sufficiently aversive. But I mean, like, yeah, best of luck to them. And it's, we're only going to leave Earth and colonize the universe if somebody's brave enough to do it. But obviously that person's not me. But yeah, I find it extraordinary.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot here to think about. I think one of the things that I love about encountering theories that we haven't seen before is that they offer this lens through which to see the world. Because you go out and all of a sudden you can start noticing behaviors, and you can start to suddenly be like, oh, that's really interesting. That's what that is. And it makes the world more legible.
Yeah, it helps a lot to just like at least have a theory of an unseen force that's causing some phenomenon, which otherwise just seems like madness. And honestly, I think that's the entire reason that we are in love with the rational method and with
Yeah.
reason and understanding history and understanding the mechanics of nature. It's like it gives you something to hold on to in the storm. And so I really appreciate the piece that you brought to us about this. I don't know if you're right or wrong still, but I think that it at least rationalizes some unseen element, like why it seems like nobody's actually at the steering wheel in some of these movements that seem obviously suicidal. It's a really compelling element.
Even if it's just partly right and somebody else hears it and goes, yeah, but if you fix this bit and this bit, then maybe you'll be even more correct. Like even that would be enough, enough that it's worth kind of thinking about it. Even if it's wrong, if it at least leads to something that's correct, then it's worth thinking about it from this perspective. It's interesting what you just said about like the unseen forces and the confusion, because I've recently started a new hobby of like finding people on mostly Twitter saying like, why is this happening? I just don't understand. And like, I'm sort of, and then saying, well, I've got a theory, I've got an explanation. And then of course it's like this massive long tweet that I think about like 3 people actually read. But it is, I'm finding myself kind of increasingly surprised by the number of people exclaiming that they just don't understand stuff. Like even, it's not that I would expect people to come up with like my little bit, half crazy explanation, but I would have thought they'd have some explanation of their own, but there are a lot of people who just see it as like, it's just crazy. I just can't explain this. Like, why are people doing this? I'm like, well, it's this thing and it works like this and it's really depressing and it's why the West is coming to an end. Have a lovely day. But
so those are the things that young people should be paying attention to. Like whenever some adult or professor or teacher or whatever says like, this is, nobody understands this or whatever, and they just kind of move on. It's like, I'm always like, that's the dark matter. Those are the black holes of that you should be fixated on, because those are the things that really need attention. So
and every time something doesn't make
sense for that.
Right. And every time something doesn't make sense to you, it's a sign that you're missing something, right? Because the world does make sense. The world is coherent, And so if something is like, oh, I didn't expect that to happen, then it's time to rethink like your understanding of that particular situation. And I think, if young people can take that view to things and maybe stop using the word random so often, and actually start understanding things that they would prefer to label as random, I think that would be a good thing for young people to do. I'm so old now, aren't I? I'm now picking on people for calling things random.
It's okay, us too. I was like, young people these days.
Yeah.
No,
the world does make sense. It can make sense, and it. So the world should make sense. Sometimes it doesn't, and I think tuning into that is just absolutely the key to anything good happening in the future for anyone in any particularity of their life or the entire society as a whole. And that's probably a good place to put a pin in this conversation.
I agree.
So
sounds good.
we will let you get on. By the way, if people haven't figured this out, Dani is talking to us in the middle of the night over there in Australia. So thank you so much for enduring the wee hours.
You're very welcome. I'm quite proud of myself. It's 4 a.m. and I'm going strong. I'm very pleased.
Goodness gracious. I hope you can get some sleep before you have to get on with your day tomorrow.
Yeah, I will. I will for sure. I've got a good 5 hours up my sleeve. That alarm is not getting set before night.
Excellent.
Goodness. All right. Well, let you get to it. Thank you so much. It's been really,
no
really
worries. It was
interesting.
an absolute pleasure. I enjoyed every second of it.
We did as well.
Take
Thank you
care.
so much, Dani.
Yeah.
Take care.
Good night. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.